We're going to be talking about this White House memo dated in January that warned the president of the coming pandemic, warned the White House of the coming pandemic. I just want to read these words to you, what Peter Navarro wrote in January. He said, "The lack of immune protection or an existing cure or vaccine would leave Americans defenseless in the case of a full-blown coronavirus outbreak in the U.S. This lack of protection elevates the risk of the coronavirus evolving into a full-blown pandemic, imperiling the lives of millions of Americans." In one worst-case scenario cited in the memo, Navarro warned that more than 500,000 Americans could die. And yet, weeks after that, John, you had Donald Trump at rallies saying that in April, when it warms up, this will miraculously go away. Put this in context with I suppose you could say with 9/11, the memos warning of Al-Qaeda attacks using airplanes, maybe missed signals FDR didn't pick up on before Pearl Harbor. I really don't know, though, what parallel there can be, because so many more people are going to die because of these missed signals.
Yeah, I'm wary of those analogies, partly because Al-Qaeda, the Japanese government, they had a certain agency. And so you're talking about an enemy who was making decisions about when to strike you. The 9/11 memo said, Al-Qaeda determined to strike in U.S. And I think what the Bush administration would say is, well, yes, they already have. What do you got? That was more perspective. This was pretty prescriptive. And I think that's what makes this memo and this crisis all the more interesting and all the more tragic. Ed talked about Greek tragedy. The issue here, it seems to me, is, are we going to be a nation governed by reason and facts? Are we an Enlightenment-influenced nation, uppercase E? Or are we a tribal collection of states and Trump supporters and Trump detractors who spend our time banging into each other instead of actually engaging with modernity and moving forward? Make no mistake, you've been talking about this. When the president goes out there every afternoon, early evening, he is going out there because he knows what the reality is, and he knows that the reality does not bathe him in glory. And so he is telling the American people, or that part of the American people who are open to his arguments, they're not arguments, they're assertions, his assertions, that nobody saw it coming. Well, this guy who talks about Trump time, this guy whom is going to become a hero of the center left that everybody disliked until the memo came out, but that's the way it goes. It's just not true. And so, because the president is ill-served by his own instincts, his own essential lack of interest in anything approaching long-term planning, he's a day trader, to use your phrase, because that mindset, that temperament, has endangered the United States in a way we have not been economically endangered since 1933. And in terms of health, as you just showed, we are losing more people than in many of the wars we spend time studying. This is a calamity. It's an absolute calamity. And the tragedy of this will be, there were people who saw it coming. And this is not, just to underscore this is not partisan. I'm not saying this because I think the president is temperamentally ill-suited to be president. I do think the president is temperamentally ill-suited to his office. But it doesn't matter. People you disagree with on 80% of things can get 20% right. That's very hard to find that 20% here. And it's changing, affecting anyway, everything about us, everything. And you don't want to be partisan in this moment. You don't want to bang on the high chair. You know, I understand all that. But at the same time, that enlightenment injunction, which is follow the facts, this is what the facts are saying. So I would just urge folks, look at the facts. Don't listen to the spin.
So, Joe, if you look at January 30th, Trump's quote is, "We think we have it well under control." And then think about this. Trump rolled back much of the progress that Obama made to strengthen global and health security. I'm reading from someone's opinion piece. He proposed draconian cuts to the National Institutes of Health, the Centers for Disease Control
These
and
are all
Prevention,
facts.
Agency for
You
International
can look at his
Development.
budget requests.
He dismissed the top White House officials in charge of global health security. And to be blunt, I am concerned that the Trump administration short-sighted policies have left us unprepared for a dangerous epidemic that will come sooner or later. That is 3 days earlier, January 27th, Joe Biden telling the country and trying to tell the president that a pandemic is on the way. And here's the problem. I say this with all seriousness, Joe, you know, because we knew him long before the campaign and we talked to him about this during the campaign and we shared it with our viewers. He doesn't read. He doesn't read. So if Peter Navarro wrote something or Biden wrote something, he does not read. Everything comes at him. He hears it on TV.
Right. Well,
this is how he gets his info.
And that's been a concern of people that have been trying to brief him since he first got into the White House. It's something that we asked him early in the campaign. Do you read? I asked, can you read? Are you capable of reading? And Willie, I think the biggest lie, and Donald Trump lies in all of these press conferences, we talked specifically, and again, this is not opinion, it's fact, that he lied about testing yesterday, said it was not the federal government's job, it was never the federal government's job. It actually was up until February 29th when the FDA finally gave up on the federal government because they had botched this so badly that the FDA said we would shut you down, CDC, if you were a private entity. But another big lie is when Donald Trump says nobody saw this coming. Peter Navarro wrote this memo on January 29th.
Yeah.
Said 500,000 Americans could die if we don't get this right. Joe Biden, 2 days earlier, wrote an op-ed in the USA Today warning of the pandemic that was coming. Joe Biden saw this coming. Donald Trump didn't see this coming. Donald Trump was still saying it was going to go away when it was warm. We only have 11 people who are sick.
He was hearing what he wanted to hear.
Yeah, that same week that Biden wrote that memo, he told CNBC he wasn't worried at all. It was just one person coming in from China. But there it was, Sleepy Joe Biden. I don't know. They may need to come up with another name than Sleepy. Prescient Joe Biden, perhaps. That same week said that this was going to be a serious problem, that the outbreak is going to cause a real problem. But you can even go back, Willie, to 2019, when HHS Secretary Azar was asked in a conference in 2019 what keeps him up at night. And he said, well, what keeps everybody up at night in this room? A pandemic. When the next pandemic comes, will we be prepared? He saw it coming. Bill Gates predicted it in 2015. George W. Bush raised fears about it in 2005. The question is, who could have seen this coming? The answer, everybody but Donald Trump. Everybody but Donald Trump and those who decided they were going to be mouthpieces for Donald Trump in playing down the threat that everybody saw coming.
Yeah, you mentioned George W. Bush. There's been a lot written in the last couple of days that he was obsessed with this, both privately and with his team, that this was coming and we had to be ready for it. The Obama administration, a group famously wrote a pandemic playbook, was sitting there in the White House waiting for the Trump administration. They dismissed it, which would have signaled, hey, this happened on New Year's Eve in Wuhan, China. We need to start preparing now, start making those the PPE, start getting those ventilators out. It's headed our way. The Trump administration ignored that playbook, threw it to the side. And as John says, the president views his job every day at 5 o'clock or whenever they hold that briefing to distance himself from all of that, to say, look, this is the state's problems. They should have been ready. To say, throw a Hail Mary and say there's this miracle drug out there for malaria and have Fox News hosts into the White House and say, hey, this is working, right? Well, in some anecdotal cases, sure it is, but the FDA says it's not ready. And then to attack reporters, as he did yesterday, a Fox News White House correspondent asked a good and straightforward question about testing. When will testing be available to everyone who wants it? He attacked that reporter and says, you should be saying thank you and congratulations for the job I've done. So all he sees up there, not to convey information, obviously we'd be better off with Deborah Birx, Dr. Birx and Dr. Fauci just holding the entire briefing with Mike Pence, carrying the other side of it. The president is in there to spin a tale, to tell us that this was not his fault, that no one could have seen it coming, and that he is here to save us from other people's failures, when really this is his failure and his administration's failure.
Well, and Mika, last week, I think it was, I said that everybody saw this coming in early January. And of course, by everybody, I mean everybody in the Trump administration, everybody that had information. This is who saw it coming. Of course, forget about 2019 and HHS Secretary Azar warning of the coming pandemic, saying it kept him up at night. Forget Bill Gates saying this was coming. Forget George W. Bush 15 years ago saying this was coming. Just in January, on January, on December 31st, actually, 2019, the CDC was aware of it and started writing up reports for HHS. The HHS secretary knew about it in early January, warned the National Security Council, who warned the president on January 3rd in the next few days. Actually, the intel agencies in the first week of January were putting it in the president's daily briefing, warning of the coming coronavirus. And the intel agencies, of course, kept passing this information around. You actually had the FDA all in. I mean, everybody inside the president's White House knew about this. And when Azar tried to talk to the president, he couldn't get him on the phone because he didn't have a good relationship with him until January the 18th. And when he finally got the president on the phone, January the 18th, when the president was at Mar-a-Lago to warn him about the coming coronavirus, the president didn't want to talk about that. Mika, do you know what he wanted to talk about? He wanted to know when flavored vaping products would be back on the market, something which I'm sure vaping doesn't help somebody when they're struck with a coronavirus.
So this is the problem when experts can't get to the president, and he's surrounded by inexperienced suck-ups, including his family. And I mean this with all seriousness. When you're surrounded by people who don't have the experience,
who are not qualified,
they can't help you.
They don't have the experience.
They can't make you better.
They don't have the experience. They're not qualified.
They shouldn't be there.
He needs to, and Joe Biden was saying this also very early on in this crisis. He said it, I think January the 31st, we have got to let science lead us here. Let the scientists speak. But Mika, as we continue to go through January, I've talked about all that. Joe Biden, again, on the 27th, was warning of the coming pandemic. On the 29th, January 29th, Peter Navarro was warning in this memo of a coming pandemic that could kill 500,000 Americans. And time again, the president said during that time period, he wasn't worried about it at all. No, we're fine. Don't worry about it. It'll go away in April when things are warm. He said we only have one person from China here that has it, and we've got it completely under control. Then he said we only have 11 people here who have it. We have it completely under control. Then he said we only have 15 people here that have it, and soon that will be down to 0. We have it completely under control. This was all at the same time that the president's own administration in January was warning him. Joe Biden was warning him. Scientists were warning him. So when Donald Trump says nobody saw that coming, it's just a lie of the first order. It is extraordinarily false. He's trying to be a revisionist. And unfortunately for him, this isn't the old Soviet Union. This isn't communist China. Journalists have the video. Journalists have the words. And even though, Mr. President, you scream and try to shout down journalists when they tell the truth, they have the final word. Oh. They have your words. They have the truth.
We have the death count. Still ahead on Morning Joe, an update on that controversy in the military after the acting Secretary of the Navy ousted, then insulted a top commander who raised concerns about the threat of coronavirus aboard his ship. He was trying to save his sailors, and the acting Navy secretary calls him stupid. The Washington Post's David Ignatius has new reporting on this. You're watching Morning Joe. We'll be right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.